this video tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to sew the young jacket. As you could already see, the pattern comes in two different lengths and you can choose between zipper and buttons. I've designed this pattern with the goal to make it as versatile as possible. You can use it for a classic denim jacket, but it's also perfect for a barn core kind of style. The fit is oversized, as I love oversized. It has quite a bit of positive ease, but it is not huge, and the positive ease is mainly in the back part. So basically the front is sleek while the back is kind of a bit puffy. To determine your perfect size, I always recommend to check your bust and also hip measurement and compare it with the size chart. If you fall into different size brackets at the bust and at the hips, I would recommend to adjust the pattern accordingly along the sides. I am, for example, a size B at the bust and a size D at my hips, so I always jump from size B to size D towards the hem to make sure that it won't turn out too tight at my hips. And you can find this and also other modifications in the written instructions under modifications. Regarding the difficulty, I would say it is not a classic beginner project because there are a lot of details and it requires precise sewing. But as you might know, my video tutorials are quite detailed, so even if you are a beginner and you're confident, you can still make it. To make this jacket, I am using mainly my regular sewing machine. I only finish the seams with my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, it's not a problem. You can simply use your regular sewing machine and set it to a large zigzag stitch. To make this jacket, you will of course need fabrics, and I recommend firm, sturdy, medium weight fabrics made of cotton. For example, cotton denim, cotton twill, gabardine, corduroy or similar. Look for fabrics that are made of 100% cotton, preferably without elastane and without polyester, and look for a weight of minimum 300 grams per square meters. Better would be 330 to 370. You can also use a thin woolen fabric such as flannel, but this pattern was not drafted for like heavy, thick or plushy coat fabrics. So if you find a thin wool fabric, it would work fine, but it's not made for heavy fabrics because the collar and also the flap might not lay nicely and stick out. Apart from the fabric, you will need buttons and or a zipper. I use classic denim buttons. I found some really cool ones that you can simply screw on. You don't need any fancy equipment. And also you will need some lightweight interfacing like 8-100. For the exact amounts, check the written instructions under materials. Here is an overview with all the pattern pieces that you will need. You will only need the small pocket if you're sewing the long jacket. And then I mark the center of the yoke, the center back and also the waistband with little notches. And then I transfer all the markings that are located at the edge with little notches to my fabric as well. If you're sewing the jacket with buttons, we now mark the position of the buttonholes and buttons. To do so, I always push pins through the ends of the buttonhole marking, and then I just connect the exit points. And then I put pins through the ends of my marking and connect the exit points to transfer the position to the opposite piece as well. Last but not least, we mark the position of our pockets and flaps. Here is a little overview. The violet one is the one for the small pocket. You only need that for the long jacket. And then blue and green are relevant for the cropped jacket, while rose and red are relevant for the long jacket. To transfer the markings, I usually cut right on the marking or cut out little corners, and then you can simply fold away the corners and transfer the corners to the right fabric side of your lower front pieces. It is usually sufficient to only transfer the corners. And here it is important to use a soluble pen. And last but not least, I transfer the markings to my waistband, cuffs and button tabs. Next, we reinforce the following pieces: one collar, both cuffs, both flaps, two of the button tabs, both facing pieces and a waistband. I'm using 8-100 and I usually cut out the interfacing roughly Then I put parchment paper on my ironing board and on top to protect my ironing board and my iron. And then you can press it on and cut out the pieces neatly afterwards. Interfacing is always being pressed to the wrong fabric side. If you're sewing the version with buttons, we now reinforce the position of the buttonholes and buttons with interfacing as well. I've cut out little squares and I will press them to the wrong fabric side of both lower and both upper front pieces. This pattern requires a lot of top stitching and you always have the choice of top stitch it just with one seam, as I'm doing here. I'm stitching with a distance of around half a centimeter. Or alternatively, to create the classic denim look, you can top stitch your seams twice, once with a distance of around 2 millimeters from the seam and then one more time with around 7 to 8 millimeters distance from the seam. This creates the classic denim look. I would recommend to make a test seam so that you can decide what you like better. And I usually top stitch with a stitch length of around 3.5 to 4. Let's start with our large pockets. I take both pieces and finish the raw edges all the way around. I'm using my overlocker, but if you don't have an overlocker, you can also run a large zigzag stitch instead. Next, we fold the top edge 3 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. The top edge is the short side, which is straight. The curved one is our bottom edge, which will lay flush with the hemline later. It's time to stitch. I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and a seam allowance of 2.5 centimeters. Now it's time to fold the sides 1.5 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. At one of the sides you will find 2 markings and I will now mark them with 2 pins because this is going to be our pocket opening. And I will now stitch right between those markings. And as I'm going to top stitch with 2 seams, I will first stitch with around 2 millimeters distance from the edge and then one more time with around 8 millimeters distance from the edge, and I'm stitching only from marking to marking. This is our pocket opening, and now pin the pocket to the right fabric side of our lower front piece. Make sure that the pocket opening is facing the side seam. The pocket lays flush with our hemline right between those markings, and it's also laying exactly on the markings. Now it's time to stitch. On the side without a pocket opening, I'm sewing straight from top to bottom, and at the side with the pocket opening, I will leave the pocket opening open. So basically I will stitch right until the pocket opening, stop sewing, and then continue right beneath the pocket opening. Here again I will top stitch with 2 stitch lines, but as always you can top stitch with 1 stitch line as well. And if you're stitching with 2 stitch lines, you can now optionally connect both stitch lines crosswise, as I'm doing here, right at the beginning and the end of the pocket opening. And this is what it will look like. You can get into the pocket from top, but also from the side. Now take your flap pieces and fold them right sides facing lengthwise so that the raw edge meets the marking, leaving a margin of 1.5 centimeter at the top. Now stitch along the short sides with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Next, clip off the corner, make sure not to catch the seam, and turn your flap right side out. Shape the corners nicely with the help of scissors, and then press the flap nice and flat. Cut off these 2 little corners, and then it's time to top stitch. I will stitch basically in a U shape along all the closed edges. I'm stitching with a seam allowance of around 3 millimeters from the edge. You can also double stitch if you like, or choose another seam allowance, whatever you prefer. Now connect the flap markings to a straight line and make sure that it is exactly 1.5 centimeters parallel to the upper edge of our pocket. Now place and pin the flap upside down right on the line. The raw edge of the flap is right on the marking, and the right fabric side of the flap is facing the jacket. Pin everything in place and make sure that the flap protrudes the pocket on both sides by the same amount. And now it's time to stitch. I'm stitching with a 1 centimeter seam allowance from the raw edge. Next, cut off these corners at the seam allowance, and then I will fold the flap down and press it in place. And last but not least, I will top stitch along the top edge with a distance of around half a centimeter. If you're sewing the long jacket with the small pockets, we first finished them all the way around. I'm using my overlocker as always, but you can also use a large zigzag stitch instead. And then I will fold the upper edge 2 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. Next, I'm going to stitch with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Now fold and pin the remaining 3 sides 1.5 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin them in place. Then pin the small pocket to the right fabric side of your lower front piece right onto the markings. I like to use a lot of pins so that nothing can shift anymore. And now I'm gonna stitch along the sides and the bottom edge, leaving the top open. I'm sewing with a small seam allowance of around 2 to 3 millimeters from the edge. As always, you can also top stitch it twice, but the pocket is quite small, so it might not look too great. To complete the front pieces, place one upper front piece on top of one lower front piece with right fabric sides facing, pin it in place, and then stitch with a regular straight stitch a 1 cm seam allowance and finish the seam. Next, press the seam flat by pressing the seam allowance into the upper front piece. And then it's time to top stitch. I will stitch down the seam allowance right onto my upper front piece, and I will run 2 top stitching seams, but as always, you can run just one as well. To complete the back piece, place the side back pieces right sides facing onto the center back piece, match up the markings and pin everything in place, and then it's time to stitch with a 1 cm seam allowance, and after that finish the seams. That's what it will look like, and now it's time to press again. I will press the seams flat by pressing the seam allowance into the side back pieces, and then I will top stitch again. I will stitch down the seam allowance right onto my side back piece, and here again I'm stitching with 2 top stitching seams, but you can also run just one. That's what it will look like, and here you can see my seam in detail. And now we only need the yoke. Place it on the back piece right sides facing, match up the center and pin everything in place. And then as always stitch with a 1 cm seam allowance, finish the seam, and afterwards press the seam allowances into the yoke and top stitch the seam right on the yoke. Now all we need are the pleats, and to create those you will find 3 markings on each side of the hem. Next I will fold it lengthwise right fabric sides facing so that the outer 2 markings are laying right on top of each other, and right there I will pin it together. If you unfold your back piece now again, you can see that there is a pleat now. Now I will lay and fold this pleat towards the center and pin it in place at the hem. That's what it should look like. And now I will repeat this step with the other pleat. Just place both outer markings on top of each other and pin them together, and then fold the pleat towards the center. Now I'm gonna secure it by stitching within the seam allowance with a little distance of around half a centimeter. To sew the shoulder and side seams, we're going to place both front pieces right sides facing onto the back piece, and we're going to pin along the shoulders and the side seams. And now we're going to pin together the side seams, and as you can see, the front armhole is way shorter than the back, which is normal. If we now place the side seams together, the shoulder seam is being pulled forward, and we won't sew the armholes close. We're going to sew in sleeves, so that's normal and not a problem. Next I'm going to stitch along the shoulders and the side seams with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I will finish all of the 4 seams. That's what it will look like, and now it's time to press. I'm pressing the seam allowances into the back piece at the shoulders but also the side seams, and last but not least it's time to top stitch. I will stitch down the seam allowance at the back piece, as always single or double. Next we're going to proceed with the facing with the jacket with buttons. If you're sewing your jacket with a zipper, skip 2 chapters, and the first thing is to press the long edges of the facing 1 centimeter onto the wrong fabric side. Then simply place the facing right sides facing onto the front edge of your jacket, pin everything in place, and at the neckline you will find a marking, and we will start pinning and also stitching right at this marking. Now it's time to stitch. As I mentioned before, I'm going to start at the marking right at the neckline. I'm sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, and as soon as I reach the corner I will leave my needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot, rotate my jacket and continue sewing so that I get a nice and sharp corner, and I will simply stitch down to the bottom edge. That's what it will look like. We have stitched from the marking down to the hemline, and now I'm going to clip off the corner at an angle, and I will also cut into the marking right until the seam, and then it's time to turn the facing right side out, shape the corner nicely, and then pin along the edge, starting at the marking again, and pin along the front edge down to the hemline. It is also important to pull out the seam allowance right at the marking at the neckline, so that basically some kind of step is being created. Next we're going to stitch along the front edge, starting at a marking again down to the hem. I'm sewing with a small seam allowance of around 3 millimeters distance from the edge, and here is our corner again. So as always, leave the needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, and then continue sewing. When you're sewing over the dividing seams it might be a bit bulky, so I would recommend to use the hand wheel here so that your needle won't break. Now we will pin the facing down along the inside as well, and as we have pre-pressed the edge we can pin it down neatly with no open edge being visible. At the top the facing is quite wide, so make sure that no wrinkles are being formed, and then stitch along this edge too with a small distance of around 3 millimeters from the edge. Next, we're going to sew the waistband for the jacket with buttons. First, fold the waistband lengthwise with right fabric sides facing and pin it together along the short sides. We won't sew along the full side, we will start and stop 1 centimeter away from the open edge. So measure this point and mark it with a pin. And now I'm gonna start sewing right from my pin down with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And that's what it will look like. And now I'm gonna press the side with no markings. Here is my button marking, and I will press the opposite edge 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side. Next, turn the waistband right side out and shape the corners nicely using scissors or similar. Now grab your jacket and pin the waistband right sides facing to the jacket hem. Match up the center back markings. I will only pin the edge of the waistband that has not been pressed, and at the front hold the side seam allowance inwards. The resulting edge here is laying flush with my front edge, and then simply pin the waistband along the whole hemline. Now it's time to stitch, and here you can see how it should be at the front. The side seam allowance at the waistband is folded inwards and the resulting edge is lying flush with the front edge. And then it's time to stitch. I'm stitching with the regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now press the seam flat by pressing the seam allowance into the waistband. And now we can pin the still open loose edge in place too. As we have pre-pressed the seam allowance, we can now pin it in place neatly with no open edge being visible. And at the front, hold the seam allowance inwards and wrap it around the front edge so everything is covered, no open edge is visible, and pin it in place. And I'm pinning so that the waistband just covers the seam, and I'm pinning with my pins upright because I'm going to stitch from the outside. Next, I'm going to stitch right on the waistband all the way around with a little distance of around 3 millimeters from the seam. I usually start at the side or at the back, so the starting point won't be visible at the front. If you're sewing over any bulky area, I recommend to use the hand wheel so that your needles won't break. And at the front we are having corners again, so as always leave the needle in the fabric as soon as you reach the corner. Lift your presser foot and rotate your fabric while the needle is in the fabric so nothing can shift anymore, and then continue sewing. That's what it will look like, and last but not least, we're going to press the waistband nice and flat. Let's continue with the facing, waistband and zipper for the jacket with zipper, and first I'm going to place the facings onto the front edge to make sure that they have the exact same length. Due to the pressing, sewing and the interfacing, there might be some inequalities, and it's important to cut the facing to the exact same length as your front edge. And next we need to press both long sides of the facing and at the waistband the edge with no markings, and I'm going to press all these edges 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side. This step of preparation is really important. I would really recommend not to skip it. Here's what it should look like, and next we're gonna pin and sew the waistband to the hem. Simply pin it to the hem, right sides facing, and we pin the edge that has not been ironed. Here's what it will look like, and next I'm going to stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Now we need one additional marking right at the center of my waistband. I will first fold it down and then I will fold it lengthwise so that the raw edges are laying together, and then I will simply mark a little notch here. This will later be our bottom edge. Grab your facings, place them right sides together to the front edge. Make sure that they match up with the neckline, and then simply pull them down so that they lay flush with the bottom edge of the waistband. The seam allowance at the facing that we have pressed to the wrong fabric side remains folded inwards, while the seam allowance at the waistband that we have pressed to the wrong fabric side is being unfolded. Next we stitch the facing and the waistband together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, basically right at the folded edge of the waistband. Next, take your zipper and pin it to any side. Here is the marking, which is our bottom, and we leave a space of around ½ centimeter between the zipper and that marking. The right side of the zipper and the right side of the jacket are laying together so that the slider of the zipper faces the jacket. And as you could see here, the seam allowance between the jacket and waistband must be folded downwards towards the waistband. And at the top, we are leaving 1.5 to 2 centimeters space between the zipper puller and our neckline. If your zipper is too long, simply pin it in place and measure 1.5 to 2 centimeters from the neckline and mark that point with a pin. I will show you how to sew in a zipper that is too long in a bit. Here's what it will look like: ½ centimeter space between the marking at the waistband and the zipper, and 2 centimeter space between the zipper puller and the neckline. And now it's time to stitch. I'm starting right at the bottom, and if you want, you can use a zipper presser foot. I'm using a upper transportation presser foot. In any way, try to stitch as close to the zipper teeth as possible. And if you're sewing over bulky areas, use your hand wheel so that your needle won't break. And in any way, we will stop 1.5 to 2 centimeters before our neckline, right at our marking. And then I will fold the protruding little end towards the front edge and stitch it down here. And in the next clip I will show you how to sew in a zipper that is too long. It's basically the same. I will start right at our marking, which is 1.5 to 2 centimeters below our neckline, and then I will simply sew it in. And once I've sewn it in, I will fold the excess part at the top towards the center front and stitch it in place here. And last but not least, you can simply cut the excess part off. Before we sew in the other side of the zipper, we mark the height of the dividing seam and also the height of the seam right between the jacket and the waistband, and then we separate the zipper and then pin the second part of the zipper in place, match up the markings that we just made, and make sure to fold the seam allowance between the waistband and the jacket downwards right into the waistband. And again, between the end of the zipper and the marking at the waistband should be a distance of half a centimeter, and we're leaving a distance of 1.5 to 2 centimeters between the zipper puller at the top and our neckline. And then it's time to stitch again. I'm starting at the top 2 centimeters below my neckline, and I will stitch all the way down. That's what it should look like. And the rest is now very simple. We basically fold the facing up so that it lays flush with the neckline. Our marking is now right at the bottom, and then just pin along the front edge. Make sure to fold the seam allowance between the facing and the waistband downwards into the waistband, and then just pin along the front edge. Our zipper is now sandwiched between the jacket and the facing. Repeat this step with both sides and then stitch from the very bottom to the very top. If you stitch from the inside, you can see the stitch line where you've sewn in the zipper, and you can stitch right on the stitch line, and here you can see the seam allowance, and make sure to fold it down into the waistband. And as this part is quite bulky, I'd recommend to use the hand wheel so that your needle won't break. And we're starting right at the bottom, and we stitch all the way up to our neckline. That's what it should look like. And next I'm going to clip off the seam allowance at the corners at an angle, and then I will turn the facing right side out and shape the corners nicely. Now pin the edge of the facing in place on the inside. As we have pressed the seam allowance at this edge to the wrong fabric side already, we can now pin it in place neatly so that no open edge is visible. Right here where I am pinning, make sure that there is a 90-degree angle between the facing and the waistband, because we're going to pin along the waistband in a minute. And as the facing gets wider towards the top, I would recommend to pin right along the zipper and then pin along the edge to make sure that here no wrinkles occur. And you can also pin and stitch along the zipper. I usually prefer just to stitch along the facing. And now it's time to stitch. I'm stitching right on the facing with a seam allowance of around 3 mm distance from the edge with a regular straight stitch, and I will start right at the top and I will stop as soon as I reach the hem. So I basically just stitch along the facing. And this is what it will look like. And now it's time to press. I'm pressing the front edge nice and flat, and then I will press the seam between the jacket and the waistband also flat by pressing the seam allowance downwards into the waistband. And last but not least, I'm pinning down the still loose edge of the waistband. We have already pre-pressed the edge here, so we can pin it in place neatly, so no open edge is visible, and I will pin it so that the seam is just covered. And I will put my pins upright because I'm going to stitch from the outside. And now it's time to stitch. I'm stitching all the way around right at the waistband. I forgot to film this, so here is the clip of my jacket with buttons. The step is identical. I'm stitching right on the waistband with a distance of around 2 to 3 millimeters. I usually start at the back, so there is no bulky thread end at the front. If you're sewing over bulky areas, use your hand wheel so that the needle won't break, and as soon as you reach the front, leave your needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, rotate your jacket and continue sewing to get a nice and sharp corner. And last but not least, give the waistband a final press. If you want, you can now create a jacket loop, therefore cut a strip to size. The measurements are 4 by 8 centimeters, and then fold it lengthwise, wrong fabric sides facing, press and then fold the open edges towards the folded edge, and then fold again and pin everything in place. This is looking like bias tape now. And last but not least, stitch along the open edge close to the edge. I'm using denim fabric here, but you can also use a lighter fabric such as cotton poplin. Next, take your collar pieces and place them right sides facing, pin along the sides and the upper edge. Now measure 1 centimeter from the bottom edge and mark this point. we will start and stop right at this marking, meaning we don't stitch until the bottom edge. I'm sewing with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. That's what it will look like. And now I'm gonna cut off the corners at an angle, make sure not to catch the seam, and then press one of the open edges 1 cm to the wrong fabric side, and I'm pressing the side that has not been reinforced with interfacing. Next, turn the collar right side out and shape the corners nicely. Next, take a jacket, and if you have any excess seam allowances along the neckline, just cut it off. And then pin the collar to the neckline, right sides facing. Match up the markings at the center back and at the collar, and at the front I hold the side seam allowance down and the resulting edge is laying flush with this little corner here at the front. I will show how to pin it for the jacket with buttons, and in the next clip I'm showing you how to pin the collar to the jacket with a zipper. And as you can see, I only pin one side of the collar to the neckline, basically the one with interfacing that has not been pre-pressed. That's what it will look like, and here you can see again how it should look at the front. And now you can see how to pin the collar to the neckline for the jacket with zipper. At the front, hold the side seam allowance of the collar down and the resulting edge is laying flush with the front edge. Pin everything in place. And here I also only pin one fabric layer to the neckline, the one that has not been pre-pressed. And now it's time to stitch. I will sew in the collar with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. I'm just showing one of the two versions because it's basically the same step. That's what it should look like. Here you can see how it should look at the jacket with buttons, and in the next clip you can see how it should look at the jacket with a zipper. Now we press the seam nice and flat by pressing the seam allowance right into the collar. And now we pin the other side of the collar to the neckline, as we have already folded and pressed the seam allowance to the wrong fabric side. We can now pin it in place neatly so that no open edge is visible. And at the front, hold the seam allowance and then wrap it around the corner so no open edge is visible, and pin everything in place. Pin along the whole neckline so that the seam is just covered. And in the next clip I'm going to show you how to pin down the other side of the collar for the jacket with the zipper. And now we also pin along the sides and the top edge of the collar. Here you can see how I'm doing it at the jacket with the zipper. I will hold the seam allowances inwards and then wrap it around the front edge so that it's fully enclosed, and then I will pin everything in place neatly. I almost forgot the jacket loop. To edit, remove some pins from the center back and then pin the jacket loop right between the collar and the jacket. Here's what it will look like, and next we're gonna stitch along the collar all the way around right at the collar. I usually start at the center back and I'm stitching right on the collar with a distance of around 3 millimeters from the edge. And if you're stitching over bulky areas such as the front part, make sure to use your hand wheel so that your needle won't break. This is our final look, and now you can give it a final press. Now we continue with the sleeves and first finish the inner edges of all 4 sleeve pieces. I'm using my overlocker here, but you can also use a large zigzag stitch instead. Next, place one upper and one lower sleeve piece together, right sides facing. Pin along this long edge, and we're gonna pin and stitch exactly 1 centimeter into the placket. Place a pin here as a marking. And now it's time to stitch. I'm sewing with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm stitching exactly 1 centimeter into the placket. Here's what it will look like. And now we're going to pin those 2 little short edges 2 times 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. At the upper sleeve, the resulting edge is laying flush with our dividing sleeve seam. I fold and pin 2 times 1 centimeter. Now it's time to stitch. I'm sewing with a 0.7 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch along both short edges. That's what it will look like. And now I'm going to press the seam allowance but also the placket towards the upper sleeve. It's the larger sleeve piece. And now I top stitch along the dividing seam and I'm stitching down the placket. I'm stitching with a 0.5 centimeter distance to the seam, and I will stitch right until the end of this dividing seam. And once I've reached the end of the dividing seam, I will leave my needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot and rotate by 90 degrees so I can continue sewing. I will sew 3 centimeters right into the upper sleeve. Now you can see everything is secured and we got a nice slit. Now we only need to form the pleats. You will find 3 markings at the sleeve hem. Fold your sleeve lengthwise, right sides facing, so that both outer markings lay exactly on top of each other. Pin those 2 markings together and then unfold the sleeve. The now resulting pleat is being folded towards the upper sleeve seam, and then I will pin it down along the hem. And last but not least, I will secure it by stitching a few stitches within the seam allowance. And next, fold the sleeve lengthwise, right fabric sides facing, and pin the sleeve seams together. Stitch with the 1 centimeter seam allowance and then finish the seam. Next, turn your jacket wrong fabric side out while the sleeves are with right fabric side out. You can see which is the front by the dividing seam. The dividing seam of the sleeve will meet the dividing seam at the back. Now slide the sleeves into the jacket so that right fabric sides are facing and the sleeves are now laying between front and back piece. Pin it into the armhole and match up the markings. The sleeve seam and the side seam meet. Then there is a marking at the sleeve head which will match up with the shoulder seam. The dividing seam of the sleeve will match up with the dividing seam of the back piece, and last but not least there is a marking at the sleeve that will match up with the dividing seam at the front. Now sew in the sleeves all the way around. I'm sewing with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I will finish the seam. And next I'm going to top stitch along the seam. I will stitch down the seam allowance at the jacket bodice, and I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and a 0.5 centimeter of seam allowance. Next, fold your cuff lengthwise, right fabric sides facing, and pin along the short edges. I will measure 1 centimeter from the open edge and mark that point, as we won't stitch across the entire length. I usually simply measure it from the top and then put a pin in there. Now it's time to stitch. I will start right at my marking. I'm sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. That's what it will look like. And now we're going to press one of the open edges 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side, and I'm going to press the side without a marking. And next, turn your cuff right side out and shape the corners nicely. We then pin it to the sleeve hem, and you can see the marking for the buttonhole. This will be on the side with the pleat, and I will pin only one fabric layer, and at the slit I will hold the side seam allowance down so that the resulting edge is laying flush with my slit. And then simply pin the cuff to the hem. I'm only pinning the side of the cuff where I haven't pressed the seam allowances to the wrong fabric side. So basically I only pin 2 layers of fabric together. That's what it will look like, and here you can see how it should look at the slit again. The seam allowance of the cuff is being held in place and the resulting edge is laying flush with the slit, and the buttonhole marking is at the side of the sleeve with the pleat. And then it's time to stitch. I'm sewing with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Next, we're gonna press the seam allowance into the cuff. And then pin the still loose side of the cuff to the sleeve hem as well. And at the slit I will hold the seam allowance inwards, and then I will wrap it around the seam allowance so that everything is fully enclosed and no open edge is visible. Here I'm pinning again upright because I'm going to stitch from the outside. And last but not least, I'm pinning along the side and also the top edge because I'm going to stitch all the way around. And now it's time to stitch. I'm stitching from the outside right on the cuff with a distance of around 3 millimeters from the seam or edge, and I start at the sleeve seam so that at the slit or at the front of the cuff won't be any bulky seam. Next, take your button tabs. 2 are reinforced with interfacing and 2 aren't. And take the ones that aren't reinforced with interfacing and draw a parallel line exactly 1 centimeter away from the short edge. Then take the pieces that are reinforced and draw the seam line. To the wrong fabric side, it is exactly 1 centimeter away from the edge. As this piece is quite small and has a lot of corners, it's really hard to get the shape right, so it's really important to draw on the seam line to get the correct shape. Then cut off this little piece at both pieces that aren't reinforced. Only this piece. And then place one piece with interfacing on one piece without interfacing, right sides facing, and stitch them together. Leave the short side open. Now it's time to stitch. I really try to stitch right on my seam line. I would recommend a rather short stitch length, and as soon as you reach a corner, leave the needle in the fabric so that nothing can shift anymore. Lift your presser foot and rotate your button tab so that you can continue sewing right on the seam line, and we leave the short side open. Next, we cut off the seam allowance at the corners. Make sure not to catch the seam. And then I also cut back the seam allowance to approximately ½ centimeter. And then it's time to turn the button tabs right side out. You can take a pencil or similar for help. Now it is important to shape the corners nicely. I like to use a chopstick to do so or similar. And then we pin along the edges. I like to roll the fabric between my finger to get the seam as close to the edge as possible. And then it's time to top stitch. I'm sewing with around 3 mm distance from the edge and a regular straight stitch, and I will again leave the short side open. Now we need a buttonhole right here. I would recommend to jump into the next chapter and sew on all the buttonholes that you need and then come back to this chapter. Here I have my button tab with the buttonhole already. This is our waistband and this is the back, this is the front, here is the side seam, and there should be a marking exactly 1 centimeter away from the side seam on the back piece. You can double check if the location is correct and if not corrected, and then simply grab your button tab and pin it right on this marking, right sides facing the waistband and the tip pointing towards the front. Then stitch 1 centimeter away from the raw edge with a regular straight stitch. Here's what it will look like, and now trim off the corners and also cut back the seam allowance. And then fold it so that it lays exactly on the waistband. Pin it in place. And now we stitch it down by stitching right here with around ½ centimeter of seam allowance. Now it's time to sew the buttonholes. Make sure that they are all around 1 centimeter away from the front edge and they all have the same distance. Then it's time to stitch, and I would recommend to check your sewing machine manual to see how you can sew buttonholes, because every sewing machine is different. That's what it will look like. We also have a buttonhole at both cuffs, right at the center, 1.3 centimeters away from the front edge, and one buttonhole at each button tab. And then I carefully cut them all open. Make sure not to cut into the buttonhole. Now we only need the buttons, and to mark the correct position, overlap the front edges by 2.5 centimeters and pin it in place. Then mark the position of the buttons, and I mark them at the edge of my buttonhole towards the front edge. At the cuff, overlap them by 3 centimeters, pin them in place, and then mark the position of the button as well. I also mark them at the end of my buttonhole towards the slit. And at the button tabs, I mark the position of the buttons on the waistband right at the center of my buttonhole. And then I will mark one more additional button, which is right at the center of my waistband, 4 centimeters away from my first button, meaning 4 centimeters away towards the center back. Now we need to attach the buttons. I use screw-on buttons, and there are different types. I simply use this screwdriver to punch a little hole into my fabric. The hole should be as small as possible, and then I put the back piece right through the hole, and with the help of my screwdriver I can now screw on my buttons. This kind of button is very practical because you don't need any kind of fancy equipment. I will link them in the video description below. And then bring on all the buttons, and once you're done, your jacket is done. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy your new jacket.